You have the ring. And I see your Schwartz is as big as mine. Now let's see how well you handle it.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. I promised it. I said on Thursday or Friday. It is Friday. Perch was going to join me here on the channel. We will take a closer look at the numbers as far as comic book sales in 2020. It's certainly better than a lot of people are putting off, and it's also, not quite as good as other people are. Here to talk with me about that is my good friend from the Comics by Perch podcast. Perch, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
So before we get into this, we have to talk about 3 caveats when you're looking at these numbers.
Yeah.
Just to kind of keep in context what we're looking at when we look at some of this growth. First off, the data based on sales tracked at point of sale by Comic Hub is systems at over 100 stores. So that's on the floppy data. It's no longer based on reports from Diamond.
Right.
And they have used that data to build a model of sales for the entire comic store channel using comparisons developed during periods in which Comic Hub and Diamond reporting overlapped. So it's a guess.
It is. It's an estimate.
Educated guess.
To the credit of John Jackson Miller and those guys, I mean, they're not hiding this information. I mean, they explain the math they're doing. They explain how they're coming to these conclusions, but people do need to realize, but it's not the guy being dodgy or anything like that. It is an estimate. It's an estimate based on a model. I have big disagreements with the Comics Hub data of using that. I think it's a single source. I think it's inaccurate.
It's too limited.
However, yes, it's way too limited. And I think the shops that use it index in a certain way. I think there's a lot of reasons why that data is not great. However, I can't fault the model that he made. I think it's a perfectly fine model. I just think there's not enough data.
Yeah, it's the data that they have available.
Yes. Yeah. Better than nothing. I will say that.
You wish they could reach out to maybe some of the retailers, big, small, large, and maybe get some people to come in on a program and give them numbers, some raw data. But I don't know that everybody wants to give away that kind of, data about their business and their customers.
They don't. And comic shops, for no apparent reason, retailers lie about this. There's this constant paranoia about who's seeing my numbers, and I've never been entirely certain why.
Okay, so the next caveat, the MPD book scans, which are used for the graphic novel sales, at least to bookstores, collect weekly point-of-sale data on print books from over 16,000 locations, including e-tailers, chains, mass merchandisers, independent bookstores, and more. MPD BookScan covers approximately 85% of the overall U.S. trade print book market. So that is very reliable, or more reliable.
Yeah, it is. I'm not sure entirely there. I was trying to figure out, were they running a model to try and figure out the other 15%, or are they just excluding it from the data? It was a little bit... And I think one area where that 15% could be wildly off is if there's a chain like a Walmart or somebody that's kind of crammed in there. But yes, the much more reliable source of data.
And the final caveat, all print figures are calculated based on the full retail price of books sold into the market and do not account for discounting or markup. And digital sales do not include subscription-based all-you-can-read services.
Yeah, and those are 2 very huge caveats, actually.
Yes, because if you go into Amazon, the biggest e-tailer in the world, the biggest retailer in America, where a lot of people buy their graphic novels, almost all of them are discounted.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's discounted. It also and it's not including kind of MSRP. I mean, some deals that are set to some of these retailers. I mean, that's a pretty massive note you have to realize. And then the other one, the digital one, is also a pretty massive note, because we have seen at least in the US, the 2 major publishers have been pushing people to a subscription service, to an unlimited service. That's where the focus of their advertising has been. So, it's not really giving us a clear picture about digital at all.
So these are the numbers that ICV2, Milton Greep and Company, and Comicron, John Jackson Miller and Company came up with together. These are the best numbers that we have, but there are definitely some areas that might not be completely accurate.
That's right.
We do see the big picture that in 2020, the estimate is $1.28 billion as far as comic sales in North America, an increase of 0.7 billion or 0.07 billion from 2019. This is great news because we did have the pandemic shutdown in 2020. But a majority of this growth, if not all of this growth, is essentially on the back of graphic novel sales. Well, it all is, because we saw floppy sales decrease. And a lot of that is on the backs of manga. We see a lot of people in the industry, Heidi McDonald, Tim Seeley's a creator that always, every year he comes out and does this. And he said, well, manga are comics too. Well, technically you are correct. But in my opinion, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, I think that's a loser argument. Not only are you never going to win because people can see through the BS that you're kind of spilling out there, but you don't sit there and go, well, the WNBA is doing great because the NBA, had a more lucrative television contract this year. Sure, they're related, but you know what I mean?
I think you have to take, if you're going to use that argument, you have to take everything with that argument. I think it's fair to say, hey, the comic industry includes manga, includes YA, includes sequential art, includes Western, US graphic novel, includes all of this kind of stuff, anything sold in North America. And one other caveat in all this, I noticed some people confused about it, is when they say manga sales, they're not talking about manga sales in Japan. They're talking about manga sales specifically in North America, which is just an important little fact to bring in, which also excludes some Amazon numbers and other things from the mix. That's why there's a lot here. And you mentioned earlier, but just for the record again, I think these guys, ICV2, Comicron, John Jackson Miller, I think they are doing a great job. I'm glad they do this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with them doing it the way they're doing it, and they are honest. And that's the key here to kind of your comment around how some people are interpreting this data. Those guys are explaining their math. They're explaining what they're including and excluding. They're not hiding anything. However, this data is getting used to make really dubious arguments. If you're going to say manga is part of comics, okay, but then you also have to take the other parts of that too. So then I showed this graph. I know you showed it as well, which showed Marvel as a large indie and manga as the mainstream. If you're going to say that manga is part of the comic industry, that chart I showed is absolutely correct. Marvel is, by effect, by the numbers, a large indie. It's no longer mainstream. Manga is definitely mainstream. But people don't want to use it that way. They want to say, we want to include the manga numbers for the overall comic industry, but we still want to say that the stuff going on here is great. It's healthy. That's like saying, Walmart and some mom and pop convenience shop have the same level of financial stability. It doesn't remotely paint that picture. So if you want to include manga go for it, but you've got to then deal with the consequences of including them in that picture.
Yeah. So essentially, of the 1.28 billion in 2020, that represents a 6% increase over sales in 2019, and that was led by strong sales of graphic novels online, in mass merchants, and strong digital sales.
Right.
And the strong digital sales are a very tiny portion of that. We'll get to that. So let's get into...
Well, and by the way, and for the record, and crowdfunding and these other sources as well. It's all wrapped up in here. And that's one of the challenges with this is people are reading the headline or the first couple sentences, and they're not going into the data and the details.
So let's get into the second chart. This one's North American comic sales by format. It's broken down into graphic novels, comic books, periodics, floppies, and then digital comics. We knew that there would be a decrease in comic books as far as floppies. The entire, everything was shut down for 7 weeks. A lot of places, even when things got back up, they weren't fully open. In my estimation, this is great news. I'm shocked that as far as the comic book, floppy market in the direct market was this resilient and was able to kind of keep their heads this far above water without things really crashing down.
Yeah, I think a lot of people expect it to be much worse. And again, one of the disingenuous arguments people are making is like, and everything's great. Everybody expected it to do worse. Everybody. There was a giant fundraiser for comic shops last year, led by a lot of pros. But they weren't doing that just because they thought they'd, give comic shops some extra money for no reason. Everybody expected this to be very bad. We saw, what was a 30% decrease in product basically going out. This wasn't, by the way, to be clear about that number, that wasn't a 30% drop in sales. It's a 20% drop in sales for floppy. The 30% is that they shipped basically 30% less comics. They didn't do that for sales reasons. They did this for the pandemic reasons. And it fits. It's about when we lost about a quarter of the year. And
also, we had pencils down. So when Marvel came back up, remember, they weren't shipping weekly. They were shipping floppies every other week, and then they would ship graphic novels in between that.
That's right. Yeah, it was very slow, and you saw companies like Valiant be slow in recovering and everything else. So that 30% number of fewer titles being sent out to market is what you would expect. I'm sure we both could have guessed it if we did a prediction in December. Hey, how many fewer titles got shipped? That would have been about the number I picked. So to your point, to get 20% less in sales is a small victory. This isn't something you give everybody a bonus and you pat yourself on the back for, but it's much better than people expected. It's also, to be completely clear about it though, that 20%, I think is a little bit, it's less of a drop than expected, in part because comics, there were more expensive comics shipped in the second half of the year. So there was more money being made because comics were costing a little bit more. So
also, they were buttressing what they were sending out with a lot more variant covers. So
that's true.
You have people buying multiple comic or issues of the same comic book. Normally, if there was a DC, they would get the 2 covers, the A and B. This time, they might have ended up getting 4 and 5 of some of those.
That's right.
Was by design.
It was by design, and you had more events crammed into the second half of the year. You had Empire, you had Ten of Swords, you had Death Metal, you had a number. I've forgotten all the ones. Joker War, the Spider-Man storyline, tons there. So there's more of, and King in Black kind of started up right at the end of the year. So there was a lot of that going on, which led to more variant covers. One thing we didn't see as much of last year was overships. There was a dramatic decrease in that activity last year, and that also likely helped the profit versus units measure.
Absolutely. So in my mind, the big win here is digital comic sales. They appear to have at least doubled from the previous year. Now, a lot of that probably has to do with the pandemic shutdown, people not being able to leave to get access to their comics, so they were buying them digitally. And the DC certainly put a focus on digital comics with their DC Digital First program. DC and Marvel, both with their subscription services, you can get access to the newer comics sooner now. It still needs to get better. They put a lot of focus in on this. This could be a big win. If it just drops right back down to stagnant, where it was essentially the past 8 years before that, where there was no growth, well, then nothing changed. But at least if they can keep some of this gain, they're finally making some inroads in digital comics, and that is a positive sign, at least for their long-term business strategies.
It is. Also tucked into that number is a pretty decent amount of manga digital sales, which benefited from Shueisha and some of their promotion of their services in the U.S. So I think we don't know the exact breakdown of where the different money sits, but I suspect, at least from looking at the numbers, looking at Shueisha's financials and some of the others, I suspect that a pretty healthy amount of that digital number is actually being driven from manga as well.
Well, there you go. Well, hopefully, if we see this, stagnate again, they haven't made the inroads that they're obviously hoping to. Right. Now let's get to the last slide. They have North American comic sales by channel, broken down by book channels, comic stores, digital downloads, other channels. There's no way that ICV2 and Comic-Con can't break this down by market set, manga, YA graphic novels, kids graphic novels, traditional U.S. comic markets. I wish they would do that. I think they don't do it for a reason, but we can see that the book channels, the big box bookstores, Walmarts and your Amazons and stuff like that, have just exponentially grown, while the comic stores, your local comic shops, sales continue to stagnate, if not drop some.
Yeah, the problem is you've got enough data to make some guesses at it, but it becomes an even worse situation than the Comics Hub kind of world, where you could make some estimates, but you're likely going to be very off. And I do wish somebody would take a crack at it. I think these two guys would be the right ones to do it. Again, going with full transparency, say, we have a little bit of data. It's suggesting this. To me, the most valuable part of what the analysis they do every year, it's not the specific numbers. It's not the exact data. It's not that it was a 5% increase this year over last year, because there's too many, like we talked about at the beginning, too many outside factors. But what you do see is the trend. And so I think the trend is interesting. I think you can start to grab some of the trend. One of the things you can do is you can look at Viz's growth in particular as somebody who is shuttling a lot of this manga into the US, and you can start to do some assessment over how successful they're doing. Manga had a great year last year. Obviously, I think in a combination of a bunch of things falling into place. There was a lot of product that was available. They got the channel working. They got that product into places it wasn't before. Netflix really kind of promoted some anime, which then led to manga sales. One of the big mysteries. It's a video with you for another time I'd love to do, which is why is anime able to translate to manga sales and Disney Plus movies are not as easy able to translate to US comic sales. It's an interesting dynamic, but all these things kind of fell into place. And of course the pandemic and all the rest, and some major manga series came out that last year. They had a breakaway year in terms of content. So it was a very strong year. Going into these different segments, I suspect 2021 is going to be much the same, if not a bigger gap. I like all things, interest in manga will fade or change over time, but right now it's dominating and it's growing its position. The one interesting part about this numbers is that they don't seem to include all of what Scholastic is doing. There's some YA in there, but there's a number of channels, particularly the most successful ones that Scholastic tends to leverage, that don't get wrapped up in this. And I suspect if you did include all that data, if you had all of it, first of all, the growth last year would have been much higher. It would actually look even better for the comic industry, but the comic industry would have been what we think of as a traditional North American comic market would have just been dwarfed by Scholastic YA and manga. It would have been absurd numbers there, and just a fraction for what we're used to.
That's the biggest problem about all of this. These numbers show, despite a pandemic setback and everything, there's an insatiable thirst that can't be quenched. There's not enough content out there. People are looking for comic related content, and unfortunately more and more they're looking outside of the traditional US market. They're still there, but the numbers have stagnated, and they're also, they're propped up by rising sales costs. The prices are going up, sure, while other parts of the market are experiencing exponential growth. And a lot of people in comic books aren't willing to admit that this is actually happening. And until they do that, I don't think they're going to be able to turn this around.
Yeah, it's funny because I see comments, from some of the names you mentioned earlier, and some creators talking about, the market is changing. And yeah, that's true. That's 100% true.
That's the point.
It's definitely changing. I think it's neither good news nor bad news. It's just inevitable. Markets change. And the question mark is are you going to be in the old market or the new market when all settles out? I think that's maybe the scary part for some people. Yeah.
You look at Blockbuster. You never would have thought they would ever shut down until it was inevitable that they had to shut down because they reacted to the market changes too late.
That's a great analogy, because I think you could say, look at the entertainment business and how it grew while Blockbuster was going out of business. It was because the entertainment business was taking into account Netflix and digital and streaming and all this other stuff that was taking off. So the numbers, the trend was going up. The entertainment business was doing great, but the traditional Blockbuster model wasn't, and they weren't adapting, like you said. And so even though entertainment as a whole was going through the roof, one part of the business wasn't. And I think the same thing is kind of, it's true to some extent with comics here. Right now, major players are coming in and they are defining what the comic industry is. It is not what a lot of people are used to. So it goes back to just the basics. When somebody says, hey, the comic industry is growing, what do they mean by that? What do they mean by industry? It is a truthful statement if you include everything. And that's great for comics, but maybe it's not great for people who worked in the old model. It's not great for the Blockbuster employee.
Well, it's good for crowdfunding. We saw 60% growth in that market. So people are doing things with US comics that are growing.
Yeah, and crowdfunding is, I think it's in this place where it's getting more visibility. People are getting a little bit more comfortable with spending their money there. There's becoming more tools to find and locate. This is going to sound absurd to a lot of people who are really in this, but one of the biggest problem from crowdfunding is visibility. A lot of people outside of comics just do not know it exists, and that problem is slowly getting changed. And so you're seeing more money flow in there. It's a new growth market. So that's great. Also,
their practices are getting better. People are delivering on time more with a better version of a product that isn't damaged. They've learned so much over the last 3 years. And like you said, people are putting more money into there.
Yeah, I mean, it's to be. I think the growth of crowdfunding is to be expected. It's becoming a more mature, business in terms of people learning from each other and what works and what doesn't. So I think you'll continue to see that grow. It's not going to grow forever. It's going to hit its ceiling, and then it will have to find new ways, like everything else. But no, it's a great growth market. I think if you're in the traditional U.S. comic market, you have to find a path either to innovate and transform yourself, or to latch on and ride with one of these others. Just saying, hey, everything's going up, all boats will rise. All boats don't rise. We know that.
Absolutely. So I'm personally encouraged by the numbers.
Yeah, me too.
The U.S. comic market, when you think about DC, Marvel, Image, in the indie market, exceptionally resilient, mostly on the back of retailers, in my opinion, and their innovations and their customer base, which made sure that they kept in touch, kept appraised of the situation, and supported them. But things can get better.
Absolutely. I think I'm very encouraged by it. What it shows is there's an audience that likes sequential art. They like reading books this way. They're willing to try different models, whether it's crowdfunding, getting your book from digital, whatever it happens to be. The customer base is willing to grow and be flexible. That's the good news out of this. And I think it's good news for the traditional comic market in the West, because there are multiple paths in front of them that can be successful as long as they take it. So the ball's in their court. I think they don't have to invent. I mean, as an innovator, I would have rather seen the US comic market invent some of these things rather than do a follow. However, that has largely not happened. So, there's still routes to follow and get success. And it's on them. I hope they do it.